The Democrats criticise plans for a long-term security pact with Iraq, which they say will bog down the United States in a civil war for years to come. Could such a treaty really work? And would the next US leader be locked into President Bush's Iraq policy? How will the future of Iraq play out under a new US administration? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Well, Iraq has again taken centre stage in the US elections. Democrats on Capitol Hill have condemned White House plans to form a long-term security pact with the stricken country. Presidential candidates Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton say it could leave the United States embroiled in a civil war for decades. As violence in Iraq continues, President Bush wants to finalise the agreement before he leaves office. It would cover political, economic and military arrangements. But opponents say it could spell disaster. So what does the proposal entail? Well, US officials say the plan will secure the two countries' long-term political, economic and security interests. And although the proposal doesn't mention the number of troops required or mention the issue of US bases there, Washington has made a number of specific demands. It wants broad authority to carry out combat operations inside Iraq. It also wants specific legal protections from Iraqi law for its soldiers and its army of civilian contractors. Yet, for the most part, the details remain sketchy, with US and Iraqi officials hoping to hammer out an agreement by mid-year. Well, joining us now are guests in London, Hassan Atiyah. He's director of the Centre for Iraqi Studies. In Washington, D.C., PHYLLIS BENNIS, director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And here in Doha, Scott Bates, vice president of the Centre for National Policy. Welcome to the programme. Scott Bates in Doha, let me start with you, if I may. We don't know much about this proposed US-Iraqi pact yet, but I mean, how controversial is it likely to be, given the wide-ranging powers US authorities are said to be asking for?
Yeah, the rumored agreement could be very controversial. There's really a possibility for two different things to happen. One is a status of forces agreement, which the U.S. has with over 80 countries, and that would cover things that you talked about, which would be immunity for U.S. soldiers, potentially for contractors. The president does have authority to do that kind of agreement. However, if there's a security guarantee involved for Iraq by U.S. forces, then it becomes something like a treaty that would need U.S. Senate approval, and then I can't see that kind of agreement getting past the United States Senate right now.
PHYLLIS BENNIS in Washington, let me bring you in here, because the administration there faces what can only be described as fierce opposition from the Democrats, because, I mean, if Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama came to power, I mean, presumably they'd be locked in this pact, wouldn't they?
Well, not necessarily. A pact signed by a president can be unsigned by the next president. Traditionally, that doesn't happen, but traditionally, neither the U.S. nor any other country signs what are known as SOFAs, the Status of Forces Agreement that Scott just referred to, with a country that's at war. It's not the same as the kind of SOFA that the U.S. might have, for example, with Japan. In Japan, the U.S. has large bases, large numbers of troops, but those troops are not allowed to go out and lay siege to Kyoto. They can't go out and put a curfew on Tokyo and begin arresting Japanese citizens. So the whole question of what happens when a country is actually occupied by a foreign army, in this case by about 155 U.S. troops and 155,000 U.S. troops and another 155,000 U.S.-controlled mercenaries, that's not the basis for a status of forces agreement. That's the basis for a war. And we are talking here about a continuing war and permanent bases, although the administration doesn't use that term.
Let's bring in Hassan Atiyah in London, because Iraqi opposition groups, including both Sunni Arabs and Shia, have said that this pact would lead to US interference in Iraq for years to come. Are they right? What's your view?
For the Iraqi people in general, they are suspicious of such an agreement, because historically Iraq witnessed a situation similar to this. In Iraq, under the British mandate, which is like Iraq under Chapter 7 with the UN. Then the British changed the mandate into bilateral treaty, and that bilateral treaty became a focal point of anger and frustration for the Iraqi people, and that treaty was partly responsible for the demise of the monarchy in Iraq. Now today, for the Iraqis, if they see that to replace the Chapter 7 and UN supervision by an American bilateral treaty with Iraq, they will smell something fishy and they will look at it as an American imposition of power in Iraq. If I have to add one thing, please. Now I will see the Iraqi will say, the American rushed the constitution, then they rushed the parliament. Neither of them helped stabilize Iraq. Now if they rush such an understanding or a treaty, they are actually adding more fuel to the fire, and by playing a divisive role in the Iraqi society, and if they are considering reconciliation, such an arrangement or a treaty will even make things worse. That's why it would be more advisable to wait for a new parliament in Baghdad, where they will elect a new parliament. Hopefully there will be a more stable Iraq with all forces joining in the parliament. Then they can have a treaty or an arrangement.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the pact in just a second. I want to come back to Scott Bates here in Doha, because this week the focus in the US primaries now seems to be shifting away from the US economy and the credit crunch back to Iraq. I mean, how important is the issue of Iraq in that campaign? I mean, do you think both sides perhaps are manipulating the Iraq issue?
Well, sure. I think that this is going to be very politicized right now. In a Democratic primary, all the energy on the Democratic side is from young activists who are essentially anti-war. And so that's why Hillary Clinton came out very early against any kind of formal agreement with the Iraqi forces on this. And Barack Obama has come out against the war. He's been against war for a long time. So I still say, though, I think the economy is going to be a very big factor in the general election. When you get to the general election, it's fewer activists that are very committed to the anti-war cause, and so the attention may be off it just a little bit. But right now, you bet, this is a very top issue for Democratic candidates.
I wanted to stay with the issue of how US politics plays into all of this for a second, and bringing back PHYLLIS BENNIS in Washington, because Senator Joe Biden, the Democrat chairman of the US Foreign Relations Committee, recently wrote a letter to President Bush saying the pact would mire, and these are his words, the pact would mire the US in an Iraqi civil war forever. I mean, how worried are US lawmakers about this pact and the actual depth and length of US involvement?
Well, I think they are very worried about it for a variety of reasons, but unfortunately I don't think there's enough concern with what I think is the fundamental problem here, is that the agreement, the proposed agreement, does not include a timetable for withdrawal of all US troops. And the problem we have, I think it's true that the issue has been thoroughly politicized in Washington by all the candidates from both parties, from members of Congress, certainly from the White House. But we should keep in mind it isn't just the young activists that are against this war. All the most recent polls for the last year and a half to 2 years have consistently showed that between 68 and 70% of all Americans want the war to end either immediately or within 1 year. And in that context, the question of the war is very, very high on the agenda. The problem that we face here is that none of the Democratic mainstream candidates, particularly Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, none of them are actually calling for a real end to the war. They want to significantly downscale the number of troops, but if you add up the various categories for which they say they would that they would leave troops, have troops remain in Iraq for such things as training, protection of humanitarian work. In the case of one or the other, they differ a little bit. One says that they would also leave troops for counterinsurgency operations. If you add up all of those various secondary functions after you take out the, quote, combat troops, you're left with somewhere between 50 and 70,000 U.S. troops and an unknown number of U.S.-backed mercenaries. So that, to me, is not an end to the war. The extreme power of things like the letter from Biden, some of the statements from the various campaigns, are far more powerful in opposing the Bush administration's version of the war than the candidates and members of Congress, unfortunately, are in saying that the war needs to end fully, which is, of course, the position of the Iraqi parliament, which has not been consulted. They want a timetable for a full and complete withdrawal. Okay, only one of the major candidates, John Edwards, has actually called for that.
It's an interesting point you make there, PHYLLIS, and I want to bring in Hassan Khatia again in London and just put that to him. I mean, we don't know much about the content of what the pact entails, but it may say that US forces in Iraq could act unilaterally without even getting Iraqi government approval to do so. Now, that's going to be very, very controversial, isn't it?
No doubt, all depends on the the actual clauses for such an agreement, if it's an agreement. In Turkey, for instance, they have certain privileges, but they have to notify the Turkish and get their consent before flying their airplane. And the Turks were in a position to prevent the American to use Turkish bases in Incirlik against Iraq. But here in Iraq, the Americans are in a more difficult position. What do they need these things? If it is only training and services, they could do this without this much trouble. But why they rush it? Why they can wait? Let the next president do it, or even a new Iraqi parliament to do it. Why make this an issue of contention and further division in Iraqi society? In addition, this will give the impression among Iraqis that the Americans, relying on their allies, the Kurds and the SCIRI, the Islamic Council and other, to pass this treaty as soon as possible, because they are afraid if a new parliament is elected, such an agreement will not be acceptable.
Okay.
So in all this, this will add blood into the situation.
All right, well, it's time for a short break now, but when we come back, we take a closer look at the future of relations between the US and Iraq and ask, what do Iraqis themselves think of this agreement? Stay with us.